This is the AS Film Exam, Section C, US Film Comparative Study. And the question I am going to walk through is, how do key sequences from your chosen American films reinforce their messages and values? And this is worth 40 marks. Both films have key scenes which reinforce their messages and values, but in different ways. Both films belong to the social problem genre, which looks at problems faced by society as a whole. In both cases, these particular American films look at the social problem of drug abuse. However, both take different approaches in the depiction of drug abuse, and neither settles for a simple "just say no" message. In Drugstore Cowboy, the opening scene jolts the audience as we see a young man, Bob, naked from the waist up and looking directly into the camera. The music is melancholic, and so we assume that events are not going well for him. His voice-over informs us, "I was once a full-time dope fiend," and since he is referring to events in the past tense, we assume that for whatever reason that he is no longer a dope fiend. So in this case, the film may well be following the traditional narrative trajectory of social problem films that deal with drug abuse. They never end happily. The film then flashes back to a healthier Bob as he enters a drugstore with his crew. They create a diversion so Bob can jump the counter and steal the drugs, mostly morphine and Dilaudid. Bob leaves through the back, then the crew leave before the pharmacy get wise to what just happened. The highs of stealing and drug taking are portrayed in the film without hypocrisy. This is important because, without showing what is in it for drug abusers to live such lives, the messages and values would be hollow and counterproductive. By contrast, the opening scene of Half Nelson is a lot more subtle in conveying its messages and values, and perhaps that can only really be appreciated on repeat viewings. We first meet Dan Dunn, Bob's counterpart, in his apartment in the early dawn. He is sitting on the floor by a table, which has drug paraphernalia on it, as his alarm goes off. It is apparent he has been awake all night. We then see him going to work. The shock does not occur until we see him walking into a room, his classroom. He begins teaching immediately and is depicted as being an inspiring teacher. This opening scene plays against several stereotypes, which are part of its overall messages and values. It conveys that not all drug abusers are inept and unemployed, as the stereotype would have us believe. And given that the film is set in a predominantly black neighbourhood, not all crack addicts are black, as the media tends to depict them. That's 9 marks so far. The climax or turning point for both films indicate when the character has seemed to decide to go against drugs, thereby fulfilling the moral that underpins both stories. 10th mark. In Drugstore Cowboy, the film heads towards a somewhat obligatory drug death as befits the social problem genre. 11th mark. In this sense, it keeps close to the traditional conventions of the drug subculture within this social problem genre. 12th mark. Traditional social problem films that deal with the drug problem, quote unquote, such as Reefer Madness, amongst others, try to shock the viewer by asserting that death is the most probable outcome when using drugs. That addiction is almost a certainty, and then when that happens, the quote unquote drug victim is beyond redemption. However, the death of Nadine, rather than, at this point at least, Bob, acts as the turning point, because, as Bob later recalls to Diane, it was at this moment he might have got caught by the police with an OD'd body that he swore to God he'd quit if he managed to survive the situation. 15th mark. Bob makes this absolutely clear to Diane later in the film, and thus it was Bob's desire to avoid what would have been a long jail sentence rather than simply the effects of the drugs that gave him the impetus to quit. 16th mark. Conversely, Dan's turning point is more gradual but culminates in his sense of defeat. 17th mark. He has spent most of the film trying to get Dre to stay away from a drug dealer that has been grooming her to begin dealing. When he thinks he has blown it and accidentally pushed her further towards the drug dealer, Frank, he loses hope and keeps taking drugs. We also know he has been suspended from teaching because of his growing problems. 18th mark. The key moment when Dre, now drug dealer, is set up by Frank, the main dealer, to see her teacher as a quote-unquote junkie and therefore manipulate her further into drug dealing through her despair, is the turning point because it is when Dre can't take anymore. 19th mark. She goes into a seedy party and sees Dan look around. He sees her and his shoulders slump in anguish as he sees who has come to bring him the drugs. He slowly and sadly nods to her to indicate it is he whom has ordered the drugs, and he gives her the money. Her heartbroken face and his indicates the perversion of what was once a solid teacher-student relationship. 20th mark. In recognition of this and Frank's mean and underhanded lesson to her, quote-unquote, Dre turns her back on Frank and goes to help Dan. 21 marks. The moral lessons she learnt in Dan's class have proven to be both her and Dan's redemption. 22nd mark. The endings are different in how they underline the principal messages and values of each respective film. In Drugstore Cowboy, we realise that Bob did not in fact hospitalise himself with a drug overdose, as we naturally assume, and was actually shot by an old drug acquaintance, David, that did not believe Bob was clean, and believed he was holding out, quote-unquote, on his drug stash, quote-unquote. The irony of this is that Bob used to routinely con David, and so now he is actually telling the truth. He has accidentally sown the seeds of his own fate. 24th mark. The message is a philosophical one. Even if you try to go straight, those you have wronged in the past may catch up with you and make you pay for your past transgressions. 25th mark. The drug bag David was looking for was given by Bob to his drug mentor, Father Tom, shortly before David accosts Bob in his apartment. In a sense, Bob tries to avoid the burden and gives it to Tom to, perversely, relieve Tom's burden of drug withdrawal. Tom is old and has accepted his fate. 26th mark. Upon being shot, Bob is wheeled to an ambulance where his old adversary, Detective Gentry, is ironically trying to find out who shot him. Bob is delirious and tells him, "The TV baby shot me," a reference only himself and Diane would understand. He asks Gentry to warn Diane about the Hat. Gentry assumes the Hat is a person whom shot Bob, and asks him whether the Hat and the TV baby were in cahoots in shooting him. As we see a close-up of Gentry writing Hat in his notebook, the tragic black humour is made clear. 27th mark. He does not understand what Bob is really saying, which Bob understands as he sighs, "Don't worry, I'll tell her myself." This is a rather cryptic remark, as we know that Bob is perhaps referring to the afterlife when they both succumb to the curse of the Hat. 28 marks. Bob realises, as he himself says, that he was a fool to think he could outrun his past. 29 marks. He says he has, quote-unquote, paid his debt to the Hat, but it is altogether uncertain to the audience whether he will survive to enjoy his debt-free existence. 30th mark. The director himself says in the DVD commentary that, in his mind, Bob does die. The fact that we do not know for certain, based on textual evidence alone, allows the messages and values of the film to resonate with the viewer. 31 marks. Perhaps getting them to see the moral message of the film without having to resort to the somewhat heavy-handed and over-the-top fatalism of traditional social problem films. 32 marks. Likewise, Half Nelson ends rather ambiguously. Dan is visited by Dre the next day in a seedy hotel. He is on his own again, like at the beginning of the film, and so he seems to have not grown during the film, nor learnt anything. 33 marks. However, Dre has learned and grown as a person thanks to Dan's efforts to get us to see the tragedy of the life she almost got sucked into. 34 marks. Dre says to Dan, "Are you ready to go?" indicating to Dan that he should leave the drug life himself. 35 marks. We then see Dan cut his beard off, which he has had throughout most of the film. It is left to the viewer to assume the significance of this. And we therefore can deduce that this indicates that Dan is going to clean up, quote unquote, both his shabby physical appearance and his life in general. 36 marks. We do not know this for sure, as he makes no life-affirming declaration like Bob in Drugstore Cowboy, but his faith in Dre's morality has paid off, and therefore we must assume that he shall repay her in kind. 37 marks. The film ends with both of them sitting on a sofa, basking in sunlight and enjoying each other's company. 38 marks. This contrasts rather sharply with the opening when we saw Dan alone in his apartment, hunched in darkness and despair. 39 marks. They will now support each other in their loneliness, and neither needs the drug world anymore. 40th mark. Full marks. But here's a little mini conclusion. In conclusion, both films have key scenes which accentuate the key messages and values of both films. Okay, so that was 40 marks. Notice the conclusion was literally one sentence. That's all you need. You don't have to go nuts, alright? Oh, it's pretty quick. If you can have a little sing. The man with the child in his eyes. Ooh, he's here again. The man with the child in his eyes.